am so excited, you guys. First, welcome to Miss V, the Storyteller podcast. Today, I am so thrilled. I have someone who has been following me and been listening to my podcast since the beginning. I call her my number one fan. And this is Michelle Hall, and I am so thrilled that she is here today. Michelle and I, we go back, and one of the things about Michelle and I is we were at a meeting and we didn't know that we were at the same meeting. And years later, a couple of years later, I saw her at a meeting and I went to hug her to thank her for being my number one fan. And then her and I started talking and we became friends and everything. And then we realized she was like, I think you were at the same meeting as I was years ago. Isn't that amazing how God will put people together? You could be in the room with someone and then years later find out that you were at the same place. So, anyway, I am just so happy to have her here. So, Michelle, please tell my audience all about Michelle Hall.
Hi, Ms. V, and thank you so much for having me on the show. Yes, I love the podcast. I love the stories. You make me laugh. You make me cry with some of your stories. You are just an awesome storyteller, and I'm so honored to be here. I am Michelle Hall, and a little background on me is I work in the accounting field. That's been my formal training. I've worked in accounting, audit, and budget, and I'm currently a budget manager at a local college, and that's my formal training. My purpose work is life coaching. I am a certified Christian life coach, and I work with women who are still dealing with negative childhood experiences and helping them get to discover who they truly are once they can heal those wounds. And that is my passion work. And it is my hope and my goal to be able to do that on a full-time basis here in the very near future. And I have my own podcast that is a companion to my company, which is The Esteemed Life. And I started that podcast back in October of 2022. And it's just been a wonderful journey. It took me a while to get to that, which we'll probably talk about here later on. But I am so excited to be a podcaster, a life coach, and doing all the wonderful things that God has me doing right now.
Oh, I am so thrilled for her. I was on her show, and let me tell you, we had the best time. She made it so comfortable for me. And I'm telling you, you all should go and listen to her podcast. And we'll talk a little bit about it later. We'll tell you a little bit more about it, but you should listen to it, especially if you're a woman and you're hurting and you need someone to listen or you need someone to hear from that's been through some things that you've been through, you want to listen to her podcast. And I'm getting ahead of myself because I love her podcast and she is such an amazing host. So I know she listens to, and she's probably heard all of my stories. So, Michelle, I'm sure it was probably difficult for you, but what story do you want to talk about today? What story resonated with you?
Well, you are right. I've listened to quite a few of them, probably all of them, and several of them resonated. But the one that I wanted to talk about today is your story about God's will or your will. That story resonated with me because in that story, you were talking about fear and how fear holds us back from doing things, keeping us out of God's will. And that's such a prevalent issue, especially with women. And so I wanted to talk about that.
Well, let me tell you all a little bit about the story if you haven't heard it. When I went back to listen to it, because I have to go back and listen to my stories because there's so many of them out there and I need to remember what I told because I don't tell y'all all my business. I tell you some, but not everything. And when I listened to it, I was like, oh my God, this is so relevant to today. The story talks about how I was on a job. I worked in a hospital and I was there for 7 years and I struggled working there. There were times I was in a parking lot and I just didn't want to go into the building. And it was becoming so difficult for me. And one day I prayed and I'm like, Lord, what's going on? And I realized that I was not in God's will. What I was doing is doing what I thought that I needed to do out of fear. And I was there for 7 years totally and completely being out of God's will. So when I realized that, I start praying and asking God, please help me to be in your will on a daily basis. And although when I realized I was out of God's will, I was still at the job 2 years longer, but God made it bearable. And I also realized that God will bless you in your mess. Even when you're out of his will, God will still bless you in it until you realize you're out of his will, and then he'll help you. And that's exactly what he did. But I also realized, because I was thinking, you just need to be in God's will, or, in your work life. No, professionally, yes, but also in your personal life, because I was in a hot mess of a relationship, and I know that was not God's will, but at the time I didn't know. And I call it a whatever ship. And I call whatever ships. This is when you don't know what it is. So it's a whatever, because I did not know what it was. I was getting mixed signals. And then I realized, I was like, oh my God, this is not God's will for me to be in this relationship with this guy, because he don't know what he wants. And I know God wants better than me. So that's kind of basically what the story itself talks about. And you need to go listen to it so you can hear about me being on the job and about the dude. So, Michelle, when you heard the story, what were your thoughts? What were you thinking when you heard this?
Well, you were talking about being on a job far longer than you knew you should have been, or not in God's will on that job. And I've had that experience as well. Um, for a while, I worked for the federal government, and I was a military spouse for many years. And we were overseas, and I started working for the federal government while I was overseas, and then came back stateside and continued federal work on a military installation that is near my home. And although the pay was very good, it was like the job from hell.
Yes,
it
I
was
feel
like
you.
it was like, oh my goodness, why am I here? And I was on that job at the local military base for, how long was I on that job? Probably 4 or 5 years. And I knew, honestly, from shortly after getting into the job, probably within a few months, that I was like, oh, I just cannot. Um, but you
Mhm,
get caught up in the salary, you get
mhm.
caught up in, oh, things will get better, you get caught up in a lot of things, and you try to push through it and be like, oh, it'll be okay. And those are the things that I thought. And but it never got better. It got worse and worse. My supervisor was uh, you know, a narcissistic type personality, and it was just the worst, like the worst job experience I have ever had. And probably stayed longer than I should have, because one, mainly because of the money. I got
Yes,
paid really, really well.
yes.
And I got to a point to where I was like, um, do I need this money, or do I need my sanity? And I came home, and I was still married at that time, and I talked to my husband, and I was like, look, I've got to do something different. I was like, this is not working for me. I'm not happy. This cannot be what God has for me to be doing. And I ended up leaving that job, taking a job with a significant pay cut, but I was so much happier. I was
Yes.
so much happier. So all money is not for you. It's not always about the money, and it's not always about being in a higher role, a higher job, because God has work for us to do in different places. And although I took a position that was lower in pay, I had much more influence on that job. I was able to reach people and just do different things that I was not able to do in the other job. And when you get to the other side of things, you look back and say, why did I stay so long? Why did
Yes.
I quit? And so yeah, I didn't want to leave because of the money mainly. And I didn't feel like it was what was in God's will for me. And so that was a big part of what resonated with me in your story, just staying on a job, feeling like that's what we needed to do. But I'm so happy that I was able to transition out of that. And yeah, it probably should have been sooner.
Well, I agree with you wholeheartedly because they paid me very well.
Mm.
And I think that was one of the reasons why I stayed as long as I did is because they kept making things more enticing. You
Right.
know, they gave us bonuses and all that. And I think that they knew, that it wasn't the best place to work because working in the hospital is very stressful,
Hmm.
but they made it so you can just change and go to different departments. So it looked like they had a high, they had a very low of what's the word? They had
Turnover rate.
turnover. Yes, they had a low turnover. That's because you could change and go from different hospitals or different branches or whatever. But after crying in the car enough times, I'm like, just like you said, money, peace of mind, money, do I and I was like, I need my peace of mind. And I did just like you. I went to a job that was, it didn't pay as much, but I had more peace with it. But I did need to make money. So I had to make another change. But I just needed to get out there. And that's so important. Sometimes you have to put your mental health in
Absolutely.
front of cha-cha-ching. And
Yep.
that's what you have to do. So is there a story of something that you did outside of work? Because like I said, I talked about personal, but there are also times in our lives when we stay in something too long that's not our professional life. Because I went professional and personal with that mess. I'm sorry, he's not a mess, with that gentleman.
Well, I was married for 27 years, and I chose to end my marriage several years ago, and that was a situation where I think we both knew that there were issues in the marriage that we needed to fix or work on, and I think we just got to a point, or I think I just got to a point where it was not working, and we wanted completely different things in life. He was going left, I was going right, and you try to hold on because we had a son that was still in the household, and I didn't take my vows lightly. I didn't get married with the expectation that I wouldn't be married forever, and so I didn't make that choice lightly. But I also know that it was probably long overdue. Um, so probably stayed a little longer than I should have, but there again, fear. You have fear of what of the effect that's going to have on your child. You have fear about the effect or the what are people going to think about you? You've been married for 20 plus years. You guys can't make it last. I had fear about being a single woman because when I got married, I was 21 years old and I was still living with my mother. I had never lived on my own. Not that I didn't think I could do it, but
Right.
just fear of the unknown, fear of something different, fear of being able to take care of myself fully and completely. And so there was a lot of things that was going through my mind that kind of keeps you in things a bit longer than I probably should have been.
Wow. Do you think that fear was the leading choice? Fear of all the things that you said that made you make the decision? Or was it one of those things is like, okay, he's not going to change. I'm trying to make this work, but he's not putting forth. Or was it a combination? Because sometimes fear can be like the lead in something, but there's other issues,
Right.
but fear is the leader of it. And if we probably didn't have the fear, maybe we could work on the other issues.
I don't know that fear was the leading cause. I
Okay.
know that it was a big reason for me staying as long as I did. Like I said, there was fear about a whole lot of things. What were people going to think? How was it going to affect my son? But there were so many underlying issues. I
Okay.
had a lot of underlying issues. um, that I had started to deal with from my childhood and from the marriage. And I just really came to the conclusion that we were just not the best partners to each other.
Okay.
I was not the best for him. He was not the best for me. We had different goals in life, and I didn't want to hinder him from doing the things that he wanted to do, and there were things that I wanted to pursue that I didn't feel like he would support me in, and so I just felt like it was the best thing to end it.
This reminds me of a story that I wrote, and you probably heard it when it was like growing out of, when you grow out of things. Sometimes you just grow out of it, and it's like, okay, I'm over this. I'm too old for this. I can't do this. And you just grow out of it. It's not that you've done anything wrong. It's not, you just grow out of it.
Right.
But I know that you really like working and helping people, that have childhood traumas and, that's going through a whole lot of things. What is some advice that you would give to someone who you clearly see is operating in fear? I mean, you could just, that person is scared of everything. And I used to be, I'm delivered, praise the Lord. But what advice would you give someone who's, their childhood traumas was so much that they are fearful of everything?
That's good. That's good because I was that person as well. I had a lot of different childhood traumas and experiences that just led me as an adult to be fearful of so many things. I was afraid, I grew up poor, so I was afraid of being broke. I didn't want to be broke, I wanted to work and do this. And I didn't have my father in my life. So I was, looking for love and all those types of things. So someone who is led by fear, I my advice would be to get into counsel or get into coaching with someone and open yourself up to talk about those experiences. My experience was that I internalized so much. I didn't talk about things. And
Amen. Same over here. Amen.
I
Same.
didn't talk about things. I internalized. I felt like I was a master in internalizer. I had the look on the outside that everything was good. I was working, I was coming up in my field, I had my family, I had my son, everything looked good on the outside, but I was a hot mess on the inside. And I I didn't have anybody that I felt like I could really talk to and share these things. And when I got into counseling and began to just open up and just allow things to be verbalized, just talking. I don't even think my counselor really did much else with me. She just listened
Listen.
because I had so much stuff bottled up inside that I had never spoken. And so I think that's a big thing for people, especially for women. We internalize, we carry the weight of the world.
Yes, amen.
And
We do.
we
Mm.
are so busy nurturing and taking care of other people, either our families. If you're married, you're taking care of your husband, you're taking care of your children, you're taking care of your parents, if you work, you're taking care of things on the job. We end up at the bottom of the list. And I just did not have anybody to talk to. And I also felt like from fear that if I did, folks would be like, "What? You? Not you?" Because I had put on that face, I had put on that facade for so long that I was fearful of people getting to know, "Oh, well, I'm really jacked up on the inside. I'm not as put together as you might think I am." And so I think that's a big part of it is that we need the outlet. We need to be able to talk it out and be able to get it out. That is so huge. That was one of the best things I could have done was to get someone where I felt comfortable and safe with that I could talk these things out. So that would be probably the biggest piece of advice that I would give someone operating in fear is to find someone that they can talk to, and they can share what their fears are. Because a lot of times our fears, they feel real to us, but they're really kind of irrational.
Hmm.
And sometimes you kind of need somebody to talk that through with, so that you can kind of see what it is and how it may not be what you think it is.
For me, I went to counseling myself. I went to therapy myself. But one of the things that I had to do and God had to share with me is I had to face my fears.
Mhm.
Because what I did was I took something very small and I made it into something huge. I made it into a giant. And I remember God had led me to David, and I was reading about David and him and Goliath, and how he went and he just faced him, he just faced it. And now when I have that anxiety or that fear or whatever, I just go and like kick the door in. What? I mean, what? I try to do it even with my procrastination. I'm like, why are you procrastinating? What is the fear behind it? Why don't you want to deal with it? And
Yeah.
then I take the time and I process the whole thing. And I'm like, okay, if it turned out bad, oh well, God, you just going to help me.
Right.
So I
Right.
think that is such great advice to go and find someone to talk to, because if you don't get to the point where you can face the fear, it's always going to taunt you. It's always going to be there. So, and when I went to counseling, you said when you went to counseling, you don't think she didn't talk it. The first thing I did was bust out crying, literally bust out crying. And she was like, oh my God, oh my God. And she had to pray for me because I was so full, because I, like you, internalized everything. And I don't know if this happened to you, but what happened to me is I started to have a lot of stomach issues,
Mm.
major stomach issues, because I worry and just absorbing and taking all that. My body couldn't take it anymore. It was like, okay, I'm gonna break down on you until you get some help. And that's what I did. I broke,
Hmm.
and I got sick, and I had to realize that it wasn't just my body, but it was also what I was doing to my body,
Right.
meaning worrying, internalizing everything.
Right.
So and I know that at the end of my podcast, I always ask questions. So we're going to talk about these questions that I ask at the end of the podcast. So, and your answer and I'll answer. So the first question, and we're talking about right now, not in our past. We're going to answer this question in the present.
Okay.
Are you working or in a relationship that that you should not be in? If so, why?
Well, I am not in a relationship at all, so that's a no-go. I am happily single, and so I don't have any issues there. But as far as work on the professional side, as I said when we first started, I am still working full time in my professional training as a budget manager, and I'm not really. I'm getting to a point where I know it's time to do something different, and I'm waiting for the signal from the Lord for when it's time for me to move. I'll just leave it like that.
Okay.
So
So,
yeah.
but where you are, do you feel like is because I feel like sometimes that we can be in God's will for a particular time. And then what happens is when that time is up, we get out of God's will when we continue to stay there.
Yes, and
So,
I do believe when I started, the job that I'm in now is the job that I got into where I said I took a pay cut, and everything was fine. I felt like it was what I was supposed to be doing. I was learning a lot. I was, it was fantastic. But here the last few years, I felt like things have been shifting. I felt like, okay, it's time for me to do something different. It's time for me to do something else. And I know myself well enough to know that when I'm feeling like I don't want to go to work because this is just not what I want to do, it's time for me to do something different. If I'm not excited, and I'm not talking about skipping out the door excited, but if I'm
right.
not excited about what I'm doing on my job, then it's usually time for me to do something else. And I'm feeling like it's time.
I'm glad you said it the way that you said it because about 2 years ago, I've been doing freelance work and I was on this particular, I took this contract, I think it was like 2 years ago. And I was working there, it was extra money coming in. And I believed at the time that it was God's will for me to be there because I was there to help the owner of the company because his books and all his stuff was a hot mess. And so I came in and I cleaned up everything and I was there for a while. And it didn't bother me so much because I had time to write. I had time to work on my podcast. I had all this time because the work that I did for him, it would come in waves. So there was times when I had down times, but then there was times when I was really busy. So I liked it, but at the time, I believe it was God's will. Now, there also came a time when I knew that my timing was getting up because of those feelings that you were talking about. How you like things are changed. It's like I dreaded going in. I'm like, this is terrible. I'm like, oh my God, I could be doing so much more for you and
Exactly.
all that. And I felt like it was, but God knows me. He knew that I would try to stay there as long as I could until I knew what God's next will was for me. And
Mhm.
then that was pushing me out of God's will because when it was like God said, okay, this is it, I would have continued to stay. But God made it. He was like, no, 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 you're not going to do that this time. And so I continued to stay in God's will because the contract ended. And then I was able to move into something else
Mhm.
for to stay in God's will. So, but for me, that was I almost um was working out of God's will. I almost and I knew I shouldn't. It almost happened, but God made so it didn't. So to answer number one for myself is it almost happened that I was it almost that I was working and I knew I shouldn't have been there because God had already revealed to me and let me know it was coming to an end. So yeah. So the next question is, do you allow fear to make you do things that you shouldn't do?
Currently, I would love to be able to say no, but fear is a powerful thing. And even if it comes up, I mean, I think it's going to come up. I think it's all in how we respond to it. I
Mm,
think it's going to come up. And I think being in God's will often pushes us outside of our comfort zone.
yes.
And that can be a scary thing, and fear can keep us from doing that. So I don't think I have anything going on right now as we speak, but something that is very recent where fear was holding me back is actually starting the podcast.
Mm,
And that had been prophesied to me back in 2020. And I was very fearful of that. It wasn't that I doubted God's word because I believed it to be true. I doubted myself and I was fearful of myself
mm,
and my capabilities of doing that work. Um, I was fearful for several reasons, but for one of the main reasons I was fearful is because, when I was growing up, I used to stutter really bad as a kid.
okay.
And that was something I'm like, I am not getting ready to get on this podcast and be stumbling over these words and sounding crazy. I'm
You
like,
were Moses when God told Moses that God
I
Moses
know.
was like, but God, I stutter. I can't be in front of Pharaoh stuttering.
And I was like, oh my Lord, I'm like, I cannot do this. And I'm like, So that was a big fear of mine, to be honest. And so last summer of 2022, I actually hired a speech coach.
Oh, okay.
And I worked with him for 6 weeks, and he is the absolute best. We have the same last name, and so I refer to him as my brother from another mother. And he was so patient with me, because even though I signed up with him, I was very resistant. And he immediately noticed that. He was like, "You had walls up." He was like, "Girl, I didn't know if you were gonna get through this training or not." Because when I'm entrenched in something, I'm entrenched. And I'm like, but I'm like, okay, I already paid this money to this guy. I'm like, I'm gonna have to make this thing work. And there was a point in that coaching where he was truly challenging me to get through some things. And I was so frustrated. And I was like, I'm getting ready to quit. I'm not doing this. I don't care if I paid you. I don't care. I'm not doing it. And
Oh my
it's
God.
funny now because we actually still talk. He has a podcast too. And so we keep in touch and everything. And but I'm so glad that I went through that program because he was able to help me. First of all, he helped me to realize that my speech didn't have to be perfect.
Right.
That was huge for me because I tend to be a bit of a perfectionist. And he was like, "Michelle, it doesn't have to be perfect." He was like, "Everybody don't speak fluently 100% of the time." He said, "That's just not how it is." So that was very helpful. And he just built my confidence up. He had me do various exercises with my voice. I did some various readings and recordings and just a whole lot of things. And he was just able to help me gain the confidence in my voice to be able to move forward with this podcast. So it was shortly after that that I launched my first episode. That was my last assignment with him, was to launch this podcast. So
Wow.
so I am so excited that I
Yes.
that I chose him and that he was very helpful, and he helped me to get over that fear through his coaching, his support, and also through prayer, because I knew it was something that I needed to do. And I said, I am not leaving 2022 without this podcast being launched. So and that was something that was very recent in the last year that I was able to overcome, and I'm so glad that I did. I'm so
I
glad.
am so glad that you did too. And I didn't know that, but I think that is so amazing how God had you to take the therapist, go to speech, or to the gentleman to help prepare you for the podcast. But one of the things that I myself, well, for me, God, I was writing stories before I had my podcast. I was writing my stories because God had me, I was doing a whole lot of writing before my podcast came to life. And I had like all these stories of things that happened to me. And one of the things that I used to take speech too. And I have issues sometimes with putting endings on words
Mhm.
because I get so excited. And sometimes I don't put endings on words. So when I start the podcast, I knew that it was two things that was going to bother me. And one is the gap in my tooth, because that's why I took speech, because I couldn't say certain words properly.
Mhm.
That, and then the fact that when I get excited, sometimes I don't put endings on my word. I'm like, people gonna think this girl don't know what she's talking about. But I don't care anymore because I'm not perfect. And I realize that you are not perfect, and that people that listen, they like you because you're real, you're down there, you're the norm everyday person. If you are one of those perfectionists, they probably would not be your people, and they wouldn't be my people because I'm imperfect,
Right.
every day. And I strive to do better. I'm conscious of it and I try. But when I mess up, I'm like, oh, well, y'all just laugh it off. I didn't put the ending on
Yes.
that word.
Yep.
I'm just human, just like you. So I would say, I'm going to answer the question now. Do you allow fear to make you do things that you shouldn't? There was a time that I did. Sometimes, but if I catch it, then I put a stop to it, because usually I'll do it out of what people are going to think, the fear of what someone is going to think. And as soon as I'm like, why are you doing that? It's because of what somebody's going to think. And I'm like, nope, I'm not going to do it. Nope, that's not what I'm supposed to do. So I I face it on a daily basis. Let's just say that, the fear of doing something that I don't want to do because of what somebody's going to think.
Right.
That would be my best answer for that. And but before I have you to tell us about where we can find you in all of that, what is the biggest piece of advice that you would give anyone that has childhood trauma, that has dealt with childhood, see, I said the word wrong, childhood trauma?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. Um, my biggest piece of advice would be if you haven't dealt with it, to deal with it.
Okay, I like
Um,
that.
because we, like I said earlier, we internalize so much. And oftentimes we don't realize that when we are internalizing these things, that they truly affect how we live on the daily. When we're holding on to things that creates various emotions in us. There could be shame, there could be guilt. You could be holding on to unforgiveness. You could be, you could have anger issues. And those things show up in your day to day life. And you may not even realize, one, you may not even realize that you're doing it. And two, it's not truly who you are. And I just really think it's important that people deal with their traumas because it has a significant effect on how you live daily, and it takes a toll on your mental health. That's
Mm,
why I ended up going to counseling, because truly I felt like I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown because I had internalized so much stuff and it just got to be such a huge burden. So I encourage anyone who has unresolved childhood trauma, or if you haven't dealt with it, haven't really faced it, to really just deal with those things and to acknowledge the way that it made you feel and how it's making you feel and live currently. That was something that I dealt with, like part of my childhood issues, which I know a lot of people grow up poor, and that's not in itself a terrible thing, but it was something that drove me as I became, a young woman, to where I didn't want to live in poverty. It was not what I wanted. So when I got married, that was something that I talked about a lot with my husband. Money, money, money. We need to save, we need to have a budget, we need to do this. And but he didn't grow up that way. So it wasn't as important to him. And that was a real point of contention for us early on. And up until we were making enough money to where we didn't have to worry about it. But so things that happen to us in our childhood, whether good or bad, influences how we live, as we get out in the world. And oftentimes when you have negative experiences, they're going to affect you in a negative way.
wow. The reason why I asked that question is because, audience, I want you to hear from someone who's had childhood traumas. And so, if you are looking for a podcast from someone who's actually been through some things, you need to go over and listen to her podcast because she has guests on the show. She also shares personal things about to help you. She gives you tips, she gives you advice, but she also shares her traumas so that you won't feel alone. So if you're out there and you are struggling and you don't have anyone to talk to, but you need to listen to someone to help you, go over to her podcast. She's going to tell you all about it, where you can reach her, where you can find the podcast and all of that. So, Michelle, please tell us because I don't want anyone to struggle if they don't have to.
Absolutely. Well, my podcast is called the Esteemed Life Podcast, and it is on Apple Podcasts, Google, iHeart, Spotify. You can find it in all of those places. You can also access the podcast through my website, which is livetheesteemedlife.com. You can reach out to me at Michelle at livetheesteemedlife.com. I believe Ms. V will have all those things in her
Yes.
notes. And yeah, that's where you can find me.
perfect. I will make sure everything is in there. And please don't struggle, you all. That's why we have podcasts out there, because there are people that are dealing with so many different things and they don't quite know what to do. But if you could just click a button and listen and find out what the next steps are, or just to get advice, or just to not feel like you are the only one. Podcasts are great. So I want you to go out and support Michelle. Michelle did not tell you all, and I know this, that Michelle is going to be, she's going to be an author.
Yes.
Soon there's a book coming out. I was a part of the first anthology, and she is now going to be a part of, I believe, the third. Isn't this the third one?
It
So
is.
it is the third one. So you all need to be looking out for. It's called Living in the Key of Joy. Is that correct? Volume 3.
Volume 3. Yes.
Okay, so I was in Living in the Key of Joy, Volume 1. So you need to also look out for that. So thank you so much, Michelle, for being here. I loved having you here. Oh, and also I was a guest on her show. So if you look it up, if you go and you listen to the podcast, look for the one that I was in. I believe I was your first or second guest.
You were my first guest.
Yay. Okay. So go and look out for that. So thank you so much, Michelle, for being here.
Thank you so much, Ms. V, for having me. And before we leave, I'd just like to let you know that I have for your listeners a free self-love journal that I will make available. We will figure out how to get that to you. I think I'll have a link for her to put in the show notes where you can download a free self-love journal to help you in your how you can show yourself more love. That was part of the series that Ms. V was on my podcast. I did a 4-part series on self-love in the month of February of 2023. And it was a great series, and Ms. V was wonderful, a wonderful guest. And so I just wanted to share that with your listeners. And yeah, that'll be available.
Okay, so I'll make sure I have it in the notes. And also, if you miss it or whatever, just contact me and I will get you to make sure that you get it. So thank you so much for taking care of my people.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
And just one more thing, I do want ladies to know that you are not alone. If you are, if you're suffering, if you're struggling and you feel like no one will understand, no one has experienced these things that I have experienced, we are all we all have had a variety of experiences, and you are not alone. I felt like I was the only one dealing with the things that I was dealing with, but as I evolved and learned more and talked to more people, I've learned that so many people are struggling with things by themselves. And you don't have to do that. Ask for help, get help. There's help out there. I have a coaching program that you can find out about on my website, or you can seek counseling. You know, counseling is not a terrible thing, but get the help that you need to get through these struggles. We do not have to struggle. There's too many resources out there now for us to be struggling with these things.
I love that. I love that because we shouldn't suffer in silence. If we need to, we need to go and get the help that we need. So thank you so much for saying that. And thank you for being on the show and even the journal, even just being kind enough to offer that to my listeners. So thank you so much again.
Thank you.